Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat. Super excited you're here. I was just type chatting and reading everybody's comments, and I was like, oh crap, it's 3 o'clock Central Time. I need to get live and actually do this live chat. So if you're watching live, thank you for joining me. If you're not watching live, no problem. This video stays on my YouTube channel indefinitely, so you can come back and get those little nuggets of wisdom if you'd like. I'm sitting here with Jessica. She is behind the scenes monitoring the chat live. So if you have any questions, you can type them out. She'll write them down for me so I can address them at the end of the chat. One of my favorite parts of doing this is getting to interact real time and answer those questions. Because I know when you're learning something new or trying to expand on something that you know, if you had that one question, you're like, if I could just get it answered, I'd feel better. So totally understand that. All right, in this week's live chat, in which I usually talk about quilting, we're recapping the new Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. So it's a video series where we work together quilting through a project or a technique, and the most recent one just started 2 days ago. So just launched and been really fun to get this together and kind of get to this point. It's a big milestone here at the, as Jessica and I call it, the therapy. Here at the therapy, it's a big milestone to launch that first video. And so hopefully if you're quilting along or just watching along, which is fine, hopefully you saw that on my YouTube channel where I started quilting the center of that mandala. In this live chat, I'm just gonna kind of give a few little tips that didn't make it into the video, a few little pointers that I had to be a little too succinct when filming. I can be a little bit more verbose in it, and of course answer your questions live. A couple of housekeeping things before we start. Smiley ruler is one of the rulers that's used in this video series, optionally of course. And I know a lot of you have ordered it and are like, where is it? We are waiting on our shipment from Creative Grids. The mailman is like Santa. Every time he comes with his big bag, we're digging in there hoping it's rulers, but we have it on good authority that we should have them any day. So if you're waiting on those orders, I am so sorry. We will send them out as soon as they come. We'll be talking about where I used Smiley and other options for you as well. And another quick thing I want to mention, in the type chat before we started, somebody said, oh, I haven't got a chance to quilt, or I'm sure I'm gonna get behind, or kind of a little bit like, oh, I don't want you to feel that way. These videos are available indefinitely. So if you aren't quilting week by week, that's fine. You work through at your own pace. Just because I have set it up on the schedule, that's for me to stay accountable to you. But you can do this at your own pace. And if you're like, man, life is just too busy right now, I can't quilt, you can still watch the videos and hopefully glean some tips and some tricks that you can apply to your quilts, hopefully. So no pressure. Please, please don't let your quilting make you feel guilty. This is a no guilt zone. I said in an earlier video, I'm like, you know, we have enough stuff to feel bad about, enough real life stuff to deal with. Let's not make quilting one of those negative things. So no rush, no like feeling like, oh, she's talking about week 1 and I haven't even watched the video yet. No worries. This is just, you know, gives me a topic, a schedule to follow, and like I said, helps me keep accountable to you. All right, so let's look at some pictures. The first thing before we get into a recap, a question came up on the type chat before we started about the optional border panel that came with, that you could add to your panel if you're quilting along with me. And the question was, which way do they go? So see that cute little bracket detail on that border? I positioned that detail so it's facing the outside because I have a weird thing about similar colors touching if they're not quite, I just wanted a little bit of a break. She put hers on the other way, and that's perfectly fine. So no worries. If you have the borders, that's kind of how I envision them going, but you know, it's not a hard rule you have to follow. So there you go. Another question that came up was, can I go into a little bit more detail about where we will be using the threads in the optional thread collection? So the optional products that I sell help monetize or help, you know, sustain the videos, but they're not required to quilt along with me. I want to make free motion quilting as easy to stumble into as possible. And these are the thread colors that I picked to go along with the panel that I designed for the challenge. So in this first video, we're dealing with the white and the yellow. So those are the 2 colors that I suggest for this section. However, you guys, it's just a suggestion. If you're a rule follower, if you're like, I need you, Angela, to tell me where to do all the things, I will tell you. Yeah, Jessica raised her hand. She's like, me, I'm a rule follower. If you're not, no worries. You put them wherever you want. So I know sometimes for those of you that are like, just tell me what to do. If I'm like, well, you could do this or you could do that, I'll give you suggestions, but please know that it's totally up to you. Like if you put a different color in there, it's fine. And as we progress through the quilt, that's when we'll start seeing those other colors kind of come into play. And I'm hoping by the end of the video series, for those of you that are a little timid, maybe I can talk you into using a little bit of contrasting thread in some of those areas. But if not, no worries. So again, that just a quick reiteration of where we're working with those threads. All right, this week's video kicked off the center of our mandala panel. So we kind of just highlighted just that yellow and white area right there. And we talked a lot about echoing. And it's funny because I think I left it in the video where I'm like, what should we do? Echo. I know that some of you might be like, I'm tired of hearing Angela say echo, super tired of it. But the thing is, it's such an easy way to make an impact on your quilts. I'm not an advocate, for me personally, of quilting really difficult things. I want to quilt things that are fun, look interesting, have an impact, but that are easy. It's like making a half square triangle. I have never seen anybody at any retreat or class be like, I want to make one half square triangle at a time. Heck no, we're like, I want to make 8. And if somebody would figure out how to make 16 at a time, we would do that too. So it doesn't have to be difficult, and hopefully some of the things will give you some encouragement that it doesn't have to be hard or difficult to finish your quilts. So starting in the center, so this, I'm going to go back. So I actually have 2 quilts going. I have one that I quilted first, and that's the one I use, the threads that match. That's the one I do before I start filming. It helps me get my ideas together, helps me kind of crystallize how I'm going to do this. It's one of my favorite parts of the challenge. Because it's so funny, people are always like, ooh, what are you going to talk about? I'm like, well, I don't know. I haven't quilted it yet. It's very difficult for me to come up with how I'm going to quilt it before I actually start. So this one with the thread color, the yellow, you can see a little hint of that yellow and white. We'll talk about that here in a second. This is the one that I quilted before we filmed. But then when I'm actually filming, when that camera is on there, you really have to see what I'm doing. So I'm using a contrasting thread. So I think in the video I might have called it light green, but it's blue. It doesn't matter. It's a contrasting thread. But I want you to see just the texture you get when the thread color blends in a little bit more. So when your face is 2 inches from the quilt, you have to remember when you step back, you're not going to see those individual parts. You're going to get that whole beautiful texture. And I will tell you, and I think I said this last week, it is very humbling to quilt with a camera right over here and right over here with a thread color that is very stark. But I think the thing to remember is when you step back, it looks great, right? I mean, there's parts of that I probably would change if I could, but it looks fine. So just remember that using that thread color that blends in a little bit more is going to cover a multitude of quilting sins. Okay, so starting with the center, the very center of the panel, and talking about echoing. When we use echoing, which is quilting the same shape a set distance away from an element or another design, we're using the echoing in different ways. And so through this video, this first one, I thought I'm going to talk about different applications of this technique. So the center decal, that little green bit in the center, I used echoing to help separate it from the filler and build it up a little bit. Now, ultimately, whatever we echo around is most often going to show it off, but here, it's not only showing it off, it's helping separate it from that dense filler. So if you're looking at your quilt, even not the mandala one, but just one you have laying around, if there's an element in there, a block that you love that's tiny, a quilting design that's kind of small, echoing is just going to help give it a little space to stand out and then let it kind of show off. And so in the video, I kind of talk about how I stitched along the fake seams, which is so funny. It was a question on one of the video. You say quilt along the seams. There's no seams in this panel. I mean the fake seams, the faux seams. If this were actually pieced, those would be seams. But if I say seams, just imagine I'm talking about the edge of the design. So I did a little bit of stitching in the ditch, and it's funny because I keep saying, you don't have to do this. This is optional. You don't have to do it. And sometimes I think that I say that too much, and I actually edit out a few of the times I say it. But that's what I like to do. I like to stitch along the seam to kind of set it, to show it off, and then echo, but you don't have to do it. Throughout this video series, I'm going to try to throw out different design ideas, different things that might be easier or more appealing to newer quilters or quilters that are busier or want to just get this done, and then things that you can do if you want to add a little more time or custom quilting to it. So it truly, and I said this all the time, it truly is a quilting adventure, a choose your own quilting adventure, right? It's like those books from the 80s, except at the end we don't all die, so it's nice. So as you're quilting along, please take my suggestions as that, suggestions, and do what you like, do what you think would be fun, and if it doesn't work, well then sometimes knowing what not to do is just as important as knowing what to do. All right, but back to echoing. So first, we saw echoing around that smaller kind of motif, that smaller element in the center just to help separate it. It's a true, and what I would call a true traditional echo. A true echo has the same spacing throughout the whole shape, right? So if we think of hand quilting, how we would echo quilt with hand quilting, it has that same spacing all the way through. But I did show how, I mean, come on, I kind of cheated a little bit to get started. But, you know, for the most part, that's the look I'm going for, that true echo. And that's really nice, especially with those, like I said, those smaller elements, or if you have something where that works out well for you. But not every echoing has to be that traditional look. And so then from there, we moved on to those points of our gold flower, or whatever you want to call that, and the echoing within that area. So this was the non-traditional echo. You really could technically call it just arc quilting, but since it is technically echoing the inside of those petals, I'm going to call it echoing. But I've quilted it so that it touches those inner points, right? So those threads come together and they swing out, so I have that echoing at the point, but then towards the inside they're touching. And there was a couple reasons I did that. First of all, most importantly, which I allude to in the video, it's more efficient that way. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But also with the space that's available in that area, if I had maintained that true echo all the way through around those points, it would have ran into that previously echoed motif. So it just allows me to fit that echoing in those irregular shaped areas. And the result, the space between, is pretty cool because now it's kind of like the shape of that flower, and then I could fill it in with a filler. Now, if you are using the coordinating thread collection, and if you feel brave enough, use the yellow for the echoing. I know it's a contrasting color. It's yellow on white, but it's actually a light gray, and it's actually a textured light gray, and that yellow, when it's pulled off of the spool, is not too drastic. So you might try it just to give it a little pop of color or to pull out that yellow that's in the panel. There's not a whole lot of yellow in the panel, so it just kind of helps build it up a little, give a little bit more of that. But if you're like, no, then you can use that white thread. It's going to look nice. There's also, if you have like a thread around that's kind of in between, a really, really light yellow, not such a lemon yellow, try it. We call that magic yellow around here. So Yellow Whisper is a great one from Glide. Chiffon, it's like a light cream. Any of those light neutrals is going to look really nice. But back to the echoing. Here, I used the Smiley ruler to create those arc shapes. And what I loved about it, I didn't really say in the video, using a ruler in a lot of different ways is such a fun, easy way to make it versatile. So even though Smiley has a curve over it, I don't think I have one laying around, don't matter. I just used part of it just to get to that point and move on. So we didn't use the whole Smiley ruler, we just used part of it. But I also showed in the video how you can do it without it. So please don't feel like you have to have that ruler, like, well, I would learn how to quilt, but Angela said I need the Smiley, so now I'm not going to do it. You don't have to. You can freehand it, and I did show how to do that. And then somebody asked in the type chat before, do you have to have Smiley? Will another arc ruler work? Absolutely. And one thing you should know about me, I wake up at night thinking about quilting. You could use a straight edge ruler. You could do the same thing with straight edge and get more of a star shape. It doesn't have to exactly match the shape. At that point, it's not really an echo, but who cares? We're still getting that cool effect. So no, use any shape that you have as long as it looks consistent and intentional, right? So even if that arc is a little different, go for it. So please do that. Now, on those echo lines on the inside of those yellow petals, I'll call them, I'm quilting those echo lines so that they stop about, I don't know, a half inch, an inch away from that inner corner. And somebody else asked, how do you know when you're at the point? Like, how do you know when to stop? Well, I just eyeball it. And if you look closely at my echoes, you'll see they're not all the same, but they are symmetrical. Each one has two. They all kind of stop near the same place. They all kind of touch the same place. And so our brains see that as perfection. If I were to zoom back and just show you the whole quilt in all its mandala goodness, you probably wouldn't notice that they were exactly the same. So I just eyeball it, but you could also use a marking tool and mark a dot, a reference dot. You could use your Designs with Lines stencil to kind of mark that line. So you can do as much as you need to do to quilt it. If you're like, no, I need to mark out the whole thing, then do that, whatever it is that you will do. So I kind of alluded to like the touching of those points. Why did I do that? Well, first we talked about space, but it's also allowed me the ability to illustrate how you can approach your quilts different. This, if you are newer to quilting, if you can wrap your mind around this, it will change your quilting life. You can look at a design and I'll say attack, that sounds aggressive. You can approach it in different ways depending on your setup, on your skill level, on your preferences, and on your machine, right? So we're not all working with the same type of machine, not even the same size of machine. So approaching it slightly different will be really helpful to make it, I don't know, more appealing to you. So one of the ways I talked about, first of all, was you could do it one ring at a time, right? So in every one of those little petals, I have stitching in the fake ditch and then 2 echo lines. One way you can go about that is you can work your way all the way around and stitch in all those fake seams. Then you can add your next row of echoes and then your next row of echoes so that you complete one step of the design before you move on to the next. All right, so why would you want to do it this way? I'm so glad you asked. This is great if you have it will fit in your throat space, whatever you're quilting. You don't have to like advance the quilt back and forth on your long arm. You don't have to, reposition the quilt a whole lot. This is great if you don't have a lot of echoes, if you just have 1 or 2. Maybe you want to go ahead and do all of one and all of the next because that appeals to your preferences. I think this would be Jessica's way, right? She wants to do every step and wants to finish it and move on to the next. That's perfect. I have no problem stopping halfway and switching it up, which we'll see here in a second. So this could be one way to go about it if you wanted. But if you're working on a quilt that maybe the area is too big for your throat space, and I don't want to have to advance my quilt just to do the top half and then come back to do the bottom half and then to do the next, I can quilt it in sections or in chunks. And making those lines touch those points allows me to do that. I could sit up here all day and be like, oh, I just love the look of the juxtaposition or whatever, but honestly, it's just easier for me to work my way around that area. So in that instance, instead of doing each step to its completion, I'm doing each section. So I'm stitching in that fake seam, I'm adding my echo lines, and then when I'm ready, moving on. So again, it's the same result. The result is the same at the end. It's just a different way to approach it. This is great if you have a lot of echo lines too. Maybe you don't want to have to keep coming back and around. And also for those of you that don't mind, breaking it up and doing part of one step and coming back to it. And one thing that I didn't get in the video, and I don't know if this is going to make sense because it just shows how weird I am about thinking about quilting. When you're trying to decide how many echo lines to put in an area, since I quilt my quilts this way, that plays a big role into the number of echoes I put in there. Okay, so if I'm thinking about working my way around an area, an even number of lines will bring me back to where I started. So if I go 1 echo, 2 echo, I'm going to end where I started, and it's not going to be as easy to continue on to the next. So adding an odd number of lines, incorporating that stitching in the ditch, or adding another echo line helps me move to the next side and then continue on around. So when I'm looking at an area, I'm not only thinking, what do I want to quilt? I'm thinking, how am I going to work my way around the area and how is it going to be more efficient for me? So the number of echo lines, the reason I picked 2 echo lines and 1 stitching in the ditch is because that's an odd number and I know that that will move me on to the other side. Now, for those of you that don't love echoing as much as I do, don't want to overthink it, you can just do 1, right? You can do each ring at a time. And in that situation, it doesn't matter how many you do. It doesn't, because you're doing all of 1. So it's really interesting to take one little bit of it and really kind of get granular or get really into the deep details, which I could sit here and talk probably for 2 hours about just this slide. So I don't know what that says about me, but so just know that you can make the quilting efficient so that you can work your way around in a way that's comfortable. Now in the video, then I filled in the space between those echo lines with a filler. We know I love quilting things to death. Quilt it till it's too much, add some more, always been my motto. But you can leave that out. If you are newer to machine quilting and don't have any good fillers that you want to use, if you're like, good Lord, it was just enough to get that echo line done, I'm stressing out, leave it out. Like that's what's really fun about it. You can come up with your own things. Now those illustrations I just showed you are straight out of the expanded resource PDF. So I do put together a free downloadable quilting diagrams. I know I say that in every video that it's going to be in this challenge. That's straight up from requests. So it's like, how do I remember what she was saying? You can print them out and keep them close. But then a few challenges ago, I started making expanded resources. It's almost like a little book. Like this one, I think was like 12 pages or something, where I show you step by step. So if you need a little bit more assistance, you can check out those expanded resources. And this challenge is only $2.99, so you can check that out. If you purchase it, then you can download it and use those if you'd like. But again, it's up to you. You don't have to. All right, so from that center, then we worked out to the next ring of the mandala. I think I cut this out of the video when I taught, why did I leave the yellow parts unquilted? Well, the yellow parts were about the same size as the echoes that I had around it, and I couldn't think of anything better to add there, so I just thought, well, we'll just leave that unquilted. So every once in a while, I leave things unquilted, right? But then we move to that next section where we're now working with an irregular space. And this is a great takeaway for those of you that have a lot of quilts laying around or plan on quilting your quilts. Your areas that you're filling in are not always going to be perfect squares or triangles. You're going to be dealing with stuff like this from time to time. And so in this part of the section, we're talking about what designs fill those irregular areas and how to use echoing to highlight different parts. One thing that's really hard to illustrate because I have so many different designs on here is whatever side you echo is the side that will draw attention, right? So with the first part, when I have that plume feather, echoing the top of that area, if I do that in each one of my sections, I'm going to get this secondary pattern where you see that kind of echoing almost come together. And it's really neat if that is what I kind of want to show off. So first we did a little bit of echoing. I used the Taj ruler just to kind of illustrate that. You don't have to have it to do that. Again, and adding 2 echoes, but you don't have to. And then throwing in a plume feather. So a question that came up, this is a great question. In the video, I talk about how do we move from one section to the next, right? First step is to learn how to quilt the design. Second step is like, how do I make this work? How do I go from one to one, next one to the next? And in here, I'm incorporating traveling or stitching along the seam to get to the next, right? So I'm picking 2 echoes. Why is that? Because I know that if I echo once and come back, it will bring me back to the side I need to be on. That's the main reason. And then traveling down to that point and then quilting my plume feather. The plume feather we've seen before, and we're actually going to see it again in this video series. It's one of those great designs that fills in irregular spaces because I can just extend that ferny kind of side out to that edge. If you're having trouble with that, in the link, it takes you, like in the link in the description box, it takes you to the video series in the expanded resource or additional resources. It gives you a link to a video. So I have a video on my YouTube channel where I show you how to do this a little bit more if you need like breaking it down step by step. But you don't have to do it this way. Remember, it is a choose your own quilting adventure. You have to ask yourself, what do I not like about this and what can I change? We can leave the echoing out or we can change the design. We can do whatever we want to do to make it fit. The reason I picked the plume feather, not only because it fits that irregular space, but because it returns to the starting point. I know that if I travel down to that lower point, I can quilt my plume feather, come back, and continue on, as opposed to a design that will move me onto the other side. So I know that this is a little bit like kind of more abstract. I don't want to say higher level. It's not higher level. It's just the next level, I guess, additional thinking of it. And this is stuff that comes the more you practice, the more you get comfortable at it. Now the question did come up, if you are on a long arm and you stitched in all your seams to stabilize it, how do you handle the traveling then? I just travel right over that line a second time. If you don't like the look of that, you can break thread and do that. In this area on my actual quilt, I did yellow for all of it. But if you don't mind tying off and starting a new line in quilting, you can do your echo lines in yellow and your plume feather in white. It'd be kind of a fun option as well. Okay, so you can leave those echo lines out if you want. You can see it's not going to give me that drastic of a different look, but again, that echoing is just going to kind of show off that outer shape. So here, I'm just quilting that plume feather so it fits the whole area. You can leave that echoing out, especially if you don't want to try it, you don't like that curvy, pointy shape, or you're like, I just love a plume feather. You can definitely do that. And then you can also use a different filler. Just because I know a plume feather is going to come back to the starting point doesn't mean I have to do something so intricate or over the top. A nice long swirl that fits the area is perfect. You can also fill it in with a different filler if you want. The one thing I do want to point out is if there is a contrast between the filler and the echoing, it's going to make the echoing stand out more. So in this instance, the spacing between the echo lines and the swirl are all fairly similar, so it all kind of has a consistent look. Those echo lines don't stand out a whole lot. So just know like that's just going to give you a slightly different look. Not bad, just different. And then there you can kind of see, if you can kind of imagine that outer echoing just continuing on. Now, I'm going to show you another option here in a second, but in my original quilt that I quilted, I alternated between 2 designs. So you don't even have to use the same design in all of those sections. You can choose and pick and choose where you want it to go with. All right, but then we saw that traditional echo again, right? So we kind of had a traditional, non-traditional, and then back to the traditional where it has that same spacing all the way around. Now what's going to happen here is since I'm echoing all the sides of that area, that shape is what's going to stand out. So instead of that secondary design, you're going to get those individual pieces pop out, and it looks really, really cool. But here's the drawback. Since it's a traditional echo, it's not touching anywhere. And since it's not touching anywhere, that means I have to start a new line of quilting. That was another question that was on one of the comments on the video. What does she mean by breaking thread? I'm not talking about throwing the cone down and throwing it through a window. I mean tying off and starting a new line of quilting. I don't know where I got that from, breaking thread, but breaking up the line of quilting, starting a new line of quilting, that's what we're doing here. It's not the end of the world. I just don't love to do it. I try to avoid it as much as I can, to the point where sometimes I'm like, this is a little bit neurotic how I'm approaching this. So this is going to take a little bit longer, not a whole lot longer, but it's definitely going to give it that custom look. I say custom. It's definitely going to give that quilting really specific to that shape. It's going to look really nice. And in the video, I use Smiley and Taj to create that echo shape. But again, you don't have to. And you don't even have to echo. You can just use filler in that area. But again, that space around it just kind of pulls out that overall shape. Now, in this instance, I only did one echo and filled it in because that's all I really needed to do. I could have added 2 echoes, but that would be another line of quilting, and it really wouldn't make much of a difference. So that's why I did that way. So again, really different, slightly different look. And here you can see a little bit further back within the context of it. It just makes that outer shape kind of pop. Really, really fun. But if I were looking at this and I liked that look, but I'm like, I don't want to start a new line of quilting. I want to keep going because I know if I stop quilting, then the kids that are at the door yelling for food, I'll have to hear them, or I'll check my Facebook or drink more wine, you know. So if I want to keep quilting, I can change it up just a bit and give it a slightly different look. So in this example, this has the same echoing on all the sides except for one, and it touches at the very bottom. The very bottom it's touching because that is my transition into it. Now this was not in the video tutorial. That tutorial ended up like 20 minutes long. I'm like, I can't spit out that much. Turns out I have a lot to say about the subject. So I cut it out, but I did just put on the Facebook group an extended version of the tutorial that includes this, me quilting it and talking through it. And I'm also gonna put it on the Facebook page here, or the website here in a little bit. So you can still check out the link in the box in your second, and it will take you to that. But why would I do that? It's touching at that bottom. I would do that because it gives me pretty much the look of that traditional echo, but it allows me that touching point to transition in and out. So that is exactly how I would handle it. And if I do it in each one, it'll look intentional, and I could sit in front of somebody and give it an artistic reason, right? I love how it just draws attention to the blah, blah, blah. Well, that's why. But it is actually a little bit more difficult because I need to echo all the sides and then fill in that area and return to where I started, and that's not easy to do. And in that video, I kind of show how to do that. So sometimes the shortcut isn't the easiest way, but it can be a little bit more efficient. So again, it's a lot of fun when you can kind of take it and make it fit your preferences and how you want to work with it. So as you're quilting along the panel, if you choose to do that, hopefully you can take all of those and you can kind of think what it is that you like to do. And again, just getting started, just trying, and eventually you'll find what you like. And that's the whole point of this video series, is to work through that and find like, oh, this is what I like to apply to my quilts that I have laying around. All right, I'm sure there's some good questions, hopefully. There was one question that I wrote down, what thread to use in the back. So on the top thread, I'm talking about colors I'm using. You can use the same thread color that you're using in the top, or I like a light gray. The backing is purple, and so if you bought all the things and you're like, I don't want to see the quilting on the back, well, let me tell you, it's like a double-sided quilt. It's like 2 sides for the price of 1. And it's hard to believe me, but when you're done, even if it contrasts a little bit, when you step back, you get this really cool all-over effect. You don't see the individual bits. But if you don't want that, then using a light gray is going to be a great option, or whatever you like. So that's what I did. I did light gray in the back. Oh, look, that's a question on there too. Oh, that must have been a good question. All right, do I have a tutorial on the Taj ruler? Do I have? I have several tutorials on the Taj ruler, and I also have free downloadable PDFs on the website. So if you go to my YouTube channel, just check out the ruler challenge. I have a whole video series on using different types of rulers with that, and I also have other ones where I show how to use Taj to do motifs, how to do other things, but not echoing. This is the first time we've used Taj for echoing, so it's very, very fun. Do I break thread going from the center teal petals to the yellow? Yes. So I could transition from that inner bit to the outer bit. So those echoes, that green part in the center I echoed, and those other echoes I did. I tied off, I broke thread, and moved into that. When you're echoing, you don't have to. I have to have my echoes, and then I fill in between it. Right? You have to have your frame, and then you fill in the space. So if I go from echoing my green part, and then I can transition by using the filler to transition to one of those points, and that works too, but I'm gonna have to use the same thread color. And since I didn't use the same thread color, and I knew I didn't want to, I wanted that white to kind of disappear so you could really see those echoes, I broke thread. So see, even myself, from time to time, you have to break your own rules. Make your own rules, break your own rules. Lots of fun. All right, so again, hopefully, I know it's a busy time of year. I know we all have a lot of stuff going on, and if you can carve out a little bit of time for yourself to quilt, I hope you can, because it's really fun to quilt along with everybody. But like I said, these will be available for you whenever you're ready. Now, next week's tutorial, we're gonna keep building, keep going to the next ring, and we're gonna see things like feathers, we're gonna see plume feathers, more echoing, a little more smiley, and I'm gonna talk about how I like to use designs throughout the whole quilt to give it a little bit of repetition. So I can't wait for that to come out on Tuesday, and then I'll be here again Thursday at 3 p.m. Central live chat to recap. And if you're not watching this live and you're like, I had that burning question, I just need to know, you can leave it in the comments and we'll be sure to I try to get on there from time to time and answer them, and I know other quilters will as well. And hey, before I wrap up, if you like any of the videos, any of the free content, any of the tutorials I put out, I hope that you'll give this video a thumbs up or subscribe to my YouTube channel. That just tells YouTube that, hey, this stuff's pretty good, and it lets other quilters find me as well. Well, I hope you all have a great, happy weekend. Stay warm, stay safe, and I will see you next week for the second week in the Mandala Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.